Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 12, Laurent Gouvion St, Marshal.
Laurent Gouvion St, the son of a small landowner of Toul, was born in that town on April 13, 1764. His father, who was a Gouvion, had married a St Cyr, but the marriage had turned out an unfortunate one, and soon after the birth of the young Laurent, a separation was agreed on. Consequently, from an early age, the boy lacked a mother's care. His father, many of whose relations were in the artillery, desired his son to enter the army, and with that object in view, sent him to the artillery college at Toul. But at the age of 18, the future marshal decided to abandon the career of arms for that of art, preferring the freedom of an artist's life to the dull routine of garrison service. Taking the bit between his teeth early in 1782, he set off for Rome, which he made his headquarters for the following 2 years, with occasional trips as far as Sicily. The year 1789 found Laurent Gouvion established in Paris with a great knowledge of art and some considerable skill in technique. Steeped in classic lore, contemptuous of dull authority, and full of youthful enthusiasm, he hailed with joy the outbreak of the Revolution. But by the end of 1792, the young painter was too keen a student of men and matters not to perceive the danger which menaced the Republic, and, like all other thinking men, was lost in astonishment, not to say at the imprudence, but the folly of the Convention, which, instead of seeking to diminish the number of its enemies, seemed resolved to augment them by successive insults, not merely against all kings, but against every existing government. In spite of this, when Europe threatened France, Laurent Gouvion was one of the first to enlist in the volunteers. His personality and former training at once made themselves felt. Within a month of enlisting, he was elected captain, in which grade he joined the Army of the Rhine under General Custine. On reaching the front, the volunteer captain soon found scope for his pencil. In an army thoroughly disorganized, a good draughtsman with an eye for country was no despicable asset. Gouvion was attached to the topographical department of the staff. He added his mother's name, St Cyr, to his surname because of the constant confusion arising owing to the number of Gouvions employed with the army. After a year's hard work on the staff, during which he acquired a thorough grasp of the art of maneuvering according to the terrain and a good working knowledge of the machinery of an army, St Cyr was promoted on June 5, 1794, General of Brigade, and 6 days later, General of Division. His promotion was not unmerited, for it was his complete mastery of mountain warfare which had contributed more than anything else to the success of the division of the Army of the Rhine to which he had been attached. The soldiers had long recognized the fact, and when they heard the guns booming through the defiles of the Vosges, they used to call one to the other, "There is St Cyr playing chess." Like Bernadotte, at first he refused this rapid promotion. He feared it might lead to the scaffold, for death was then the reward of failure, and besides this, the Gouvions were classed among the ci-devant nobles. As a commander, the new general speedily proved that, much as he admired liberty in the abstract, he would have nothing but obedience from his men. Tall of stature, more like a professor than a soldier, through all his career wearing the plain blue overcoat, without uniform or epaulettes, which were affected by the generals of the Army of the Rhine, St Cyr soon became one of the best-known generals of Republican France. As one of his most bitter enemies wrote of him, it was impossible to find a calmer man. The greatest dangers, disappointments, successes, defeats were alike unable to move him. In the presence of every sort of contingency, he was like ice. It may be easily understood of what advantage such a character, backed by a taste for study and meditation, was to a general officer. In the Army of the Rhine, de Saxe and St Cyr were regarded as the persons whose examples should be followed. The austerity of their manner of life, their sincere patriotism and laborious perseverance left an indelible mark on all with whom they came in contact. But though they had much in common, they were really very dissimilar, for de Saxe was intoxicated with the love of glory, full of burning enthusiasm, sympathetic to an extraordinary degree, exceedingly susceptible to the influence of the moment. While St. Cyr loved duty as the rule of his life, modeled his action by the strict laws of calculation, was absolutely impervious to outside influence, and never knew what it was to doubt his own powers. But with all his great gifts, he had many faults. He was exceedingly jealous, and without knowing it, he allowed his own interests to affect his calculations. Consequently, very early in his career, his fellow generals hated to have to work in cooperation with him, and he got the name of being a bad bedfellow. Further, excellent as he was as a strategist and tactician, the details of administration bored him. He never held a review, never visited hospitals, and left the threads of administration in the hands of his subordinates. Consequently, much as his troops trusted him in the field, they disliked him in quarters, because, while his discipline was most severe, he did nothing to provide for their needs or amusements. From 1795 to the Peace of Campo Formio, St. Cyr shared the fortunes and vicissitudes of the Army of the Rhine, serving as a subordinate under Hoche, Jourdan, and Moreau. The Battle of Biberach in 1796 was his personal triumph. With one single corps, he defeated 3/4 of the whole of the enemy's army and drove it en route with a loss of 5,000 prisoners. But in spite of this victory, and numerous mentions in dispatches, on being introduced to the Director Rubel, after the Treaty of Campo Formio, he was actually asked, "In which army have you served?" An explanation was necessary, whereupon the director, finding that the general understood and spoke Italian, sent him off at once to take command of the Army of Rome. On March 26, 1798, he arrived there and commenced his first independent command. His task was a difficult one. The officers of the army had risen in revolt against MASSÉNA, who had made no attempt to pay them or their troops, but had spent his time in amassing a fortune for himself. The new general had orders to arrest certain officers and restore discipline. It was a task admirably suited to his talents, and within 4 days of his arrival, the disaffected were arrested and the mutiny quelled. His next duty, according to the command of the Directory, was to remove the Pope from Rome. By a queer coincidence, the officer entrusted to escort His Holiness to Tuscany was a certain Colonel Calvin. So far, St. Cyr, much against his wish, had carried out the orders of the Directory, but his next action was spontaneous and dictated by his own idea of justice. It was the hour of spoliation. A committee appointed by the Directory was busy in transporting to France all the masterpieces of Italian art, and the newly appointed consuls of the Roman Republic were likewise fully engaged in acts of vandalism. When the general heard that the magnificent oblation of diamonds belonging to the Doria family had been purloined from the Church of St. Agnes to grace the necks of the wives of the bastard consuls, he at once ordered the ostensoir to be returned to its owners. The consuls appealed to the Directory. So after a command of 4 short months, St. Cyr was recalled, only to be sent at once to resume his old position as a divisional commander in the Army of the Rhine. From there, in June 1799, he was hurriedly dispatched to Italy to aid Moreau, who was attempting to stem the victorious advance of the Austrians and Russians. He arrived in time to take part in the hard-fought fight of Novi and to help to organize a stubborn resistance on the slopes of the Apennines. Before the Battle of Novi, he actually had a glimpse of the redoubtable Suvorov himself. The Russian general, who trusted his own eyes more than the reports of his scouts, one day rode right up to the line of French vedettes clad in his usual fighting kit, a shirt and pair of breeches, and after a hurried reconnaissance, returned to his camp and gave his celebrated order. God wishes, the Emperor orders, Suvorov commands that tomorrow the enemy be conquered. Novi added luster to St. Cyr's reputation. It was his strenuous resistance on the right flank and his admirable handling of the rear guard which prevented the victorious Allies from hurling the beaten French through the passes into the sea. But Novi was an easy task compared to what was to follow. The passes of the Apennines had to be held, and Genoa covered with a handful of men dispirited by defeat and half mutinous from want of necessary food. It was a rabble, not an army. There was no commissariat, no pay chest, no store of clothing. Meanwhile, Genoa lay smoldering in rebellion at his rear. The task suited the man, By a series of clever feints and maneuvers in the valley of the Bormida, he outwitted the enemy and gradually restored the morale of his troops, and was able to hurry back to Genoa with 3 battalions at the psychological moment when mutiny and rebellion were showing their head. With absolute calmness, he told the civic authorities to prepare quarters for 8,000 troops, of which the few with him were the advance guard. The authorities, staggered by his sudden appearance, never doubted the arrival of this fabulous force, and subsequently St. Cyr was able to occupy all the strongholds in the town with the handful of troops he had with him, and then, at his leisure, to arrest the ringleaders of the rebellion. Meanwhile, the judicious establishment of free soup kitchens in the streets alleviated the necessities of the mob. Scarcely was Genoa pacified when the general was confronted by a much more serious event. Famine had driven the soldiers to mutiny, and even the very outposts withdrew from contact with the enemy and announced their intention of returning to France. It was only by raising a forced loan from the Ligurian government and delivering a most touching appeal to their patriotism that he was able to persuade the mutineers to return to their duty, telling them that if they left the colors, he intended, with the generals, officers, and non-commissioned officers, to hold the positions occupied by the army. Further, to encourage them, he began a series of small engagements, which restored their morale and led up to the Battle of Albano, where he inflicted so severe a defeat on the Austrians that Genoa was for a considerable time relieved from all danger. The first consul, on hearing of the victory of Albano, at once sent St. Cyr a sword of honor, a Damascus blade in a richly engraved sheath, with the pommel encrusted with diamonds, which had originally been intended for the Sultan. But though thus rewarded by receiving the first sword of honor ever given by the first consul, he was never a persona grata with Napoleon. Accordingly, at the beginning of 1800, he was withdrawn from the army of Italy and sent as lieutenant to Murat, who was to operate in the valley of the Danube, while Bonaparte reserved the theater of Italy for himself. It was most unfortunate for St. Cyr that he was supposed to belong to the Murat faction, for day by day the struggle between that general and the first consul became more bitter. Murat took no trouble to conceal his dislike of Bonaparte, and on hearing a rumor that the first consul intended to take command of the army of the Rhine and install him as second in command, he lost his temper and told his staff at dinner that he did not want a little tin Louis XIV with his army, and that if the first consul came, he would go. Meanwhile, great friction arose between the general and his new commander-in-chief. St. Cyr, proud of his late achievements, severely criticized the plans and organization of his chief, who was extremely indignant at the idea that anybody should doubt his ability to manage an army of 130,000 men, and at the same time to command in person the reserve corps of 25,000. So Murat belittled St. Cyr's achievements. St. Cyr at Enghien, Moskirch, and Biberach showed his accustomed skill as a tactician, but failed to keep in touch with the columns on his right and left, and increased his reputation as a jealous fighter. The Second Battle of Biberach was a masterpiece of audacity, and to his dying day the general, when recalling his success, always maintained, "On that day I was a man." During the operations round Ulm, relations became still more strained, and St. Cyr was glad to seize the excuse of a wound to demand his return to France. The first consul took the line which he always pursued with those whom he disliked but feared. He rewarded St. Cyr by making him a counselor of state, and at the same time he got him out of the way by sending him on a diplomatic mission to Spain. The general remained at Madrid till August 1802, and then, after a short period of leave at Paris, he was dispatched in 1803 to command the army at Faenza, which was to occupy the kingdom of Naples after the rupture of the Treaty of Amiens. During the 2 years spent in command of the Army of Occupation, he had many opportunities of showing his patience and diplomatic skill. The court of Naples had to be treated with all honor, but watched with the greatest care. Every effort had to be made to maintain outwardly an appearance of great cordiality, while Napoleon's demands had to be insisted on to the letter. The situation was further complicated by the continued interference of Murat, who commanded the army of Italy, and who desired to have the army of Naples under his control. The strictest discipline had to be maintained among the troops to prevent the Neapolitans having any handle to use against the army of occupation. So successfully did St. Cyr keep his troops in hand that the Neapolitan minister wrote in his next dispatch to the Queen, "Madame, we can make nothing of that point. These men are not soldiers, they are monks." In spite of many an anxious moment, these 2 years in Naples were pleasant years for the general, who delighted in the congenial society of the many men of letters who were attached to his army. For, as Paul-Louis Corneille wrote of him, he is a man of merit, a learned man, perhaps the most learned of men in the gentle art of massacre, a pleasant man in private life, a great friend of mine. But there was one great disappointment connected with this Neapolitan command, for in 1804 St. Cyr found his name excluded from the list of marshals, and the empty title of Colonel General of the Cuirassiers and the Grand Cordon of the Legion of Honor in no way made amends for this disappointment. The outbreak of the war with Austria in the autumn of 1805 caused Napoleon to withdraw the army of occupation from Naples, and St. Cyr hastened north in time to help MASSÉNA drive the Austrians out of Styria and Carinthia. He greatly distinguished himself at Castelfranco, where with a smaller force he captured the whole of a column of the enemy under the Prince de Rohan. A month later he was sent back in haste with 30,000 men to reinvade Naples, which Napoleon had given as a kingdom to his brother Joseph. But on hearing that he was to act as a subordinate to MASSÉNA, he threw up his command and withdrew to Paris. This independent conduct increased Napoleon's dislike for him, and he was peremptorily ordered to return to Naples, where he remained till August 1806. It was not till 2 years later that the emperor once again employed St. Cyr on active service. But the task he then called upon him to perform was one that would make any general who was anxious about his reputation hesitate to undertake. For Napoleon sent him with a motley force of some 48,000 Swiss, Italians, and Germans to restore French prestige in the mountainous country of Catalonia, and ended his orders with the words, "Preserve Barcelona for me. If it is lost, I cannot retake it with 80,000 men." In Barcelona lay the French general, Duhesme, who had been hustled into that town by the Spanish regulars and guerrillas after the news of the great French disaster at Belen. It was absolutely vital to the French to relieve Duhesme before lack of provisions caused him to surrender. But before any advance could be made, it was necessary to seize the fortress of Rosas, which lay on the flank of the road from France to Barcelona. This post St. Cyr successfully took by assault under the very guns of Lord Dundonald's fleet. But still, the problem of relieving Barcelona was a difficult one. There were 2 alternative lines of advance. The first and easier lay along the coast, but was exposed to the guns of the English fleet. The other road was a mere track through the mountains, and was accordingly extremely difficult owing to the excellent opportunities it gave to the guerrillas. But St. Cyr, keeping his 17,000 men well in hand and taking every precaution against ambushes, successfully broke through the lines of regulars and guerrillas, relieved Barcelona, and pushed on down the coast towards Tarragona. His further advance was stopped by the rapid reorganization of the Spanish armies in Catalonia, and it became clear that until Girona, which commanded the mountain road to France, was taken, the French forces in the south would always be in danger of having their communications cut. Accordingly, the emperor ordered him to return to assist General Verdier to capture this important town. Girona had at one time been a fortress, but it was now simply covered with a feeble rampart. But the courage of the townspeople and their patriotism was fired by the example of Saragossa, and their spirit was animated by their governor, Alvarez, whose order, "Whoever speaks of capitulation or defeat shall be instantly put to death," was received with shouts of delight. Owing to quarrels between St. Cyr and Verdier, to the stubbornness of the defense, and above all to the constant success of the Spanish General Blake in throwing provisions into the town, the siege, which commenced by sap and assault, gradually drifted into a mere blockade and lasted for 6.5 months. At last the emperor, angry at the constant bickering between the commanders and at the protracted siege, superseded St. Cyr by Marshal Augereau. However, it did not suit that marshal to take over his command until there seemed a reasonable prospect of success, and accordingly he waited at Perpignan for news of the approaching end of the siege. At last St. Cyr, in disgust, threw up his command without waiting for the arrival of Augereau. The emperor marked this act of insubordination by sending him under arrest to his country estate and depriving him of all his appointments. Accordingly, one of the few French generals who never sustained a defeat in Spain passed the next 2 years of his life in disgrace without employment, while day by day the French arms were suffering reverses in the peninsula. It was not till 1812 that the emperor recalled St. Cyr to active employment and gazetted him to the command of the 6th Corps, which, together with the 2nd Corps under the command of Marshal Oudinot, was employed on the line of the Dwina to cover the communications of the forces advancing on Moscow. The campaign in Russia showed the general at his best and at his worst. In the operations round Polotsk, his great tactical ability enabled him, with the small forces under his command, to foil again and again the efforts of the Russian commander, Wittgenstein. But owing to his want of supervision before the winter arrived, the 6th Corps, which entered Russia 25,000 strong, had been reduced to 2,600 bayonets. It was not till his corps had almost disappeared that he bestirred himself and compelled his subordinates to look after the well-being and provisions of their men. Moreover, when placed under the command of Marshal Oudinot, while carrying out to the letter all orders transmitted to him, he invariably refused to aid him with his advice, and even during the first battle of Polotsk, when asked his opinion, he merely bowed and said, "My Lord Marshal," as though he would say, "As they have made you a marshal, you must know more about the matter than a mere general like me. Get out of it as best you can." But as soon as a wound caused Oudinot to retire from the field, he at once seized the reins of command, and so great was the influence and confidence that he inspired that in a few hours the army which Oudinot had left, scattered and depressed with its back to a river, was advancing victoriously and sweeping all before it. But, good soldier as he was when left in supreme command, he unfortunately would not act in cooperation with others, and when at the end of October, Victor, with 25,000 troops, arrived to reinforce him, he seized the opportunity of a wound to throw up his command and return to France. As one of his critics says, all that St. Cyr needed to be a consummate commander was a smaller share of egotism, and the knowledge to attach men and officers to him by attending to their wants. Still, Napoleon recognized his services against Wittgenstein by at last making him a marshal. An attack of typhus and a burst blood vessel deprived the emperor of his new marshal's assistance until after the armistice of Dresden. This was the first occasion on which the two had actually come into close contact, and Napoleon quickly saw that Thrawn, and jealous as St. Cyr undoubtedly was, his clearness of brain made his advice of the highest importance, while St. Cyr speedily fell under the charm of the great emperor. Accordingly, all through the campaign, Napoleon constantly came to him for advice, which was never withheld. Remembering also his great reputation as a master of mountain warfare, the emperor entrusted him with the duty of holding the highland passes leading by Pirna on to Dresden, while he himself hurried off to Silesia. In the great battle round Dresden, the marshal's 20,000 raw recruits played their part nobly. Napoleon, to cover his own mistakes, laid the blame of Vendôme's disaster on St. Cyr and Marmont. But in his private letter to the marshal, he placed the blame on Vendôme as he wrote, "That unhappy Vendôme, who seems to have killed himself, had not a sentinel on the mountain nor a reserve anywhere." When the emperor fell back on Leipzig, he entrusted the defense of Dresden to St. Cyr, leaving him 22,000 troops and provisions for 8 days. After a siege of a month, the marshal was compelled for lack of powder to surrender with the honors of war. But the Allies, after the evacuation of the town, refused to carry out the terms of the surrender, and retained him and his troops as prisoners of war. Consequently, he took no part in the campaign of 1814. During the 100 Days, he remained quietly at his country estate. But on the Second Restoration, he was called upon to undertake the duties of Minister of War, to disband the old army and to organize the new forces of France. His tenure of office was short, as he refused to serve a ministry which proposed to cede French territory to the enemy. In May 1817, on the accession of a liberal ministry, he once again took office, and during this period he laid the foundation of the general staff of the army. But in November 1819, he resigned and lived in retirement till he died at Hyères on March 17, 1830. During his hours of leisure, the Marshal wrote his memoirs, which he intended to aid the future historian of the French wars. These memoirs show how clear and cutting his judgments were, both of men and matters, and his criticisms throw many useful lights on Napoleon's character and his methods of warfare, while they also, to a great extent, reveal his own character. No one who reads them can doubt that St. Cyr was a great strategist, while his powers as a tactician are proved by his never-failing success on the field of battle. But in spite of these talents, the Marshal's actual record as a soldier is spoiled by his defects of character. A great believer in living by rule, he had two maxims which he ever clung to. First, that in war acts of kindness are too often harmful. Second, the old adage of Machiavelli, that a victory destroys the effect of the worst operation, and that the man who knows how to give battle can be pardoned every fault that he may have before committed in his military career. It is to these two maxims that we must attribute the want of supervision he showed over his troops and his absolute lack of cordiality towards his fellow marshals and generals, which gave him the nickname of the bad bedfellow. For that he did not lack the talents of an organizer is shown by the way, when roused, he provided for his troops in Russia, and also by the success of his efforts when Minister of War. But of all his gifts, undoubtedly the most useful was his absolute coolness. No matter how badly the fight went, no matter if he were run away with in his carriage and carried straight through a brigade of the enemy's horse, he never was ruffled, never lost his clear grip on the situation. His bitter enemy, MacDonald, well summed up his character in answer to Louis XVIII's questions as to whether he was lazy. "I am not aware of it," said the Duke of Tarentum. "He is a man of great military capacity, firm, honest, but jealous of other people's merit. In the army he is regarded as what is called a bad bedfellow. In the coldest manner possible, he allowed his neighbors to be beaten, without attempting to assist them, and then criticized them afterwards. But this opinion, not uncommon among soldiers, is perhaps exaggerated, and he is admitted to have calmness and great capabilities."
This concludes Chapter 12 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 13, about Bondamansi. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.